Thank you very much. Well, first of all, a big thank you to the Center of Excellence, nccr, and the MOVE here at the University of Neuchâtel for this invitation to hold the public lecture, and particularly to Vesta and to Melinda. Let's see. Oh, Melinda is there. Okay. And to Robin as well. And of course to Michaela for agreeing to be a discussant today. I will start my lecture with a short reflection on how the concept of social networks was used in migration studies, and I will follow with the trajectory to show you how my theoretical research focus has actually shifted from the function and character of social networks to how these networks are formed. And I will continue with two case studies from my research looking at the role of changing contexts in how people make or fail to make ties during migration. Now, in migration studies, we find many references to the concept of social networks. And as was already mentioned in our discussion, these concepts are rarely precisely defined and operationalized. The focus in migration studies is also primarily on functions of social networks. This focus on network functions is very much in line with the intellectual roots of social capital theory, that is with the works of Pierre Bourdieu, of James Coleman, and later on of Nan Lin as well, who coined the term network social capital and understood it as a particular form of research present in social networks which can be accessed or mobilized in purposive actions. Now, in other words, of course, these are resources people derive directly from their social ties. And in the case of migration studies, the focus is here primarily on two functions of networks, so channeling from country of origin to country of destination and adaptive function in the country of destination. Now, with this focus on network social capital, researchers found evidence that its quality varies with the network composition, and the diversity of the network is linked whether we have ties to people who are, so to say, not like us in terms of gender, ethnicity, class, or in general in terms of status. So the people who belong to different social circles, one may say even to different social worlds. Now, this is often referred to as well as to weak bridging ties after Granovetter's work. In other words, people with whom ties are formed and the character of these ties translate into the diversity of social network and consequently into their potential function. In migration studies, it was often assumed that ties to representatives of the so-called receiving society are those that will provide migrants with better quality of resources than ties to their co-nationals. This way, migration studies actually failed to address the role of ties to other national groups or to other dimensions of ties diversity, such as class or education. And Louis Ryan rightly pointed out that rarely actually migration studies differentiated also between horizontal and vertical ties, where the latter link migrants with higher social strata of the receiving society. However, we can find also in research, among others, the work by Laura Morosano, research that questions this binary division of good quality social capital from natives versus poor quality social capital from migrant connationals, and provide evidence actually that ties to other migrants who are cultural and network brokers in the destination country actually allow migrants to access resources to achieve their aspirations. Now, with studying the consequences of social ties, many researchers have taken for granted the process from which ties arise. The focus on networks' function in migration studies is often based on this assumption that people act rationally, that they are motivated by both instrumental and expressive needs, to act purposefully, to minimize costs and risks, and maximize profits. So in other words, because some people in the network represent a resource, their knowledge, money, they can be used to achieve a specific goal. So that is why we aim actually to establish or sustain a tie. Now, in social network theory, this mechanism of tie formation is called benefit-based, meaning that people make connections because of the gains they anticipate. And since the question why people make ties is here answered in rational terms, the question how people make ties becomes irrelevant. Such a focus on social capital theory, on this micro level of decision-making, leaves out larger structural forces. And in addition, it may result into also, we can say, this blaming the victims phenomenon, yes? Blaming the victims for their problems, since one could conclude that if only people bothered to network more effectively, then they would have access to better resources. Marie-Louise Small wrote that not asking how people form useful ties creates important problems. Among others, it leaves unanswered a critical question, I think, for migration studies. What mechanisms account for network inequality? If some do better because they have more ties than others, then it seems important to understand why they have more ties. If some do better because they have ties to particular people and not others, it is also important to ask how they manage to form such ties and not others. Now, this benefit-based mechanism that I mentioned from social network theory also claims that people form ties to reduce discomfort. This reduction of discomfort is present in what Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton termed the principle of homophily, so the tendency of people to associate with people who resemble them. Although they point to three different aspects behind this tendency, that is demographic factors, personal preferences, and structural factors, in migration studies, the focus seemed to be very much on personal preferences, which are seen as a result of the ethnic and cultural characteristics of the study group. I think it is very important to look at all the dimensions of homophily, so also baseline homophily and all the aspects of so-called inbreeding homophily. Baseline homophily relates to social structure and occurs due to demographic factors. So, for example, we have the large size of a particular group. That means that an individual actually has a much higher chance to meet people who are similar to him or her when the pool of potential contacts like him or her is larger. And this here nicely links to this opportunity-based mechanism of tie formation from social network theory, so the opportunity to interact. This opportunity for migrants, of course, changes with the increasing number of their connationals. This means that they have more opportunities to meet people of their own nationality. Inbreeding homophily in turn refers not only to personal preferences, but also to social structures below the population level, such as, for example, faith organizations or migrant organizations. And again, this is often linked as well to the increase of the size of the group, because new institutions and organizations are created around issues related, for example, to legalizing status of stay in a given country or in terms of accessing the labor market. Now, two studies that were for me eye-openers in this network journey to find this answer as well to questions of how ties are formed were those by Susanne Wessendorf and Michael Eve. Wessendorf, she studied, among others, Vietnamese and Turkish speakers living in Hackney. She claimed that social relations are characterized by a coexistence of separation and mixing. These migrants do not mix, many do not speak much English. Both groups of migrants have very self-sufficient support networks, but at the same time, they interact in mainstream society in the context of residential mixing and in institutions, so nurseries, schools, as well as in business and trade, so restaurants, corner shops, nail parlors. Furthermore, this specifically marked so-called ethnic places, such as restaurants or grocery shops, they form bridges between these groups and the residents of other origins. Now, such social connectedness does not necessarily go along ethnic lines, but other categorical boundaries such as class and education can be here important. These separate worlds are accepted as normal as long as fellow residents participate in one way or another in these associational spaces or in the public realm. So what is important here was that she pointed to space that gives the opportunity for regular interaction and contact as crucial. Yes, it does not necessarily have to translate into the formation of ties, but there is the opportunity to form ties. On the other hand, Michael Eve, who studied networks actually of internal migrants in Italy, he questioned the assumption that the composition of the individual network is primarily the result of a sense of comfort based on cultural intimacy or an identity motivated by this desire to be among his or her own. Yes, he says this is too little to claim the formation of a durable tie. He thinks that what is here important, he mentions as well that people basically, they want also achieve various objectives. That's why they make new ties. But he says also what is more important, that we do not know about the context of the relationship formation, whether it occurs in school, neighborhood, at work. And then he says that it can be precisely the ethnic concentration in one social ambience, from neighborhoods to churches to kinship itself, which leads to the high percentage of intra-ethnic marriages or friendships. So this is this crucial point that Eve stresses, that making ties is not independent, but it comes in clusters. Eve writes that any personal tie tends to spring from a previous tie, yes? And if we think in terms of ties clustering, following one from another, this may explain this overrepresentation of friends, marriage partners in the same ethnic group. If we want to understand why ethnic concentration in some cases are particularly high and long-lasting, we should turn to activities and participation in these circles where relationship and social activities are maintained and recreated. Now, before I look more in depth at how people make useful social ties, I wanted to introduce the definition of social networks originating from relational sociology, which I in the end adopted. So Jan Fuchse defined networks as dynamic social constructions involving complex processes of communication, which not only reproduce but also change social relationships. As I mentioned in the discussion, I shifted myself from a very structural, very static definition of networks to this definition because it does not have this underlying assumption of the stability of social relations. And this allowed me as well to include this reflection about how ties are formed or how people fail to form ties. Now, to answer these questions, I needed also to know how to understand a tie. And here again, from relational sociology comes closely with the definition that each tie is a sedimented interaction because it already has a history of past social interactions and that impact actually future interactions. Now, these ties within the network are interdependent, and how this pattern looks affects the particular tie. This allowed me to think about social networks not only being in a process, so to say, but also evolving at different paces, new ties forming, old ones changing or breaking. In migration studies, we find some examples of concepts on how to capture the change in migrants' networks. We have the concept developed by, proposed by Joris Schapendonk, yes, who introduced in his research the concept of networking to move away from this definition of networks as static social structures. And he points here to three basically structural networking elements. So the changeability in the existence of ties, with some new ties, others lost, others dormant. The fact that the contents of the ties we have changed, the fact that the ties are interdependent, and he pointed as well to the individual agency, that this is this effort to create and maintain networks and to mobilize ties. Another concept proposed by Louise Ryan and John Mulholland is that of embedding, that was also mentioned during the discussion, is to understand the processes through which people become more or less rooted over time in systems of social relationships. What I find especially interesting here is the fact that apart from the dynamics, is that embedding is contextualized and differentiated. We embed to different degrees in different areas of activities depending on the type, strength, and duration of the relationship. Now, this concept was further developed by Miranda Lubers and colleagues, and they looked at processes of local and transnational disembedding over time. And they found out that the migrants they studied met new people through two mechanisms: to transitivity, so meeting people through friends or acquaintances. This is exactly what Eve also was referring to, the ties come in clusters. And the other mechanism was through meeting opportunities created by shared institutional context or other contexts of socialization, so at work or school. Now, according to this research network, research networks have changed more substantially in response to critical life events such as marriage, divorce, getting a child. But such events, they reactivated some relationships, but they created also new meeting opportunities for interaction. They also found out that networks changed due to cyclical events, for example, religious festivities, summer holidays, but also due to chance. Yes, for example, losing someone's phone and losing the contacts. The finding that I found here highly relevant is that strong ties, so those with whom respondents felt close, were rarely lost, they were rather dormant, which is rather intuitive. However, weak ties were likely to disappear the moment people no longer were active in those institutional settings in which these ties were made. Now, in a daily stream of interactions, people develop relationships with other people in many contexts: at work, at school, in grocery stores, at the gym. Scott Feld referred to this as this focus of repeated social interaction, so different entities around which joint activities are organized. And this is in line with research that started already in the 1950s with the work of George Homans, who proposed that repeated social interaction increases trust and positive sentiments between people. Regular interaction mean that people start trusting each other, although they would not necessarily describe their relations as close. When we change our job, if we shift from, academia to business or civil society, we change as well the context of interaction. And I found in this regard very inspiring the works by Maria Louise Small, who studied, among others, single mothers at child care day centers, and who noted that this organizational and institutional embeddedness of social interaction not only provides the space for interaction, but it also mediates interaction via its norms and rules of behavior. He distinguished between normative institutions that tell actors how they ought to behave and cognitive institutions that shape their perceptions of their circumstances. For example, whether co-workers perceive one another primarily as competitors or instead as members of the same team. When interaction is competitive, the parties are competing over a particular resource. Small writes that competition makes opponents out of actors, undermining trust and the formation of friendship. And the dynamics of cooperation differ here substantially. In cooperative interaction, the parties work jointly to accomplish a collective goal. Cooperating with strangers tends to produce friendships. In addition, an institution is usually tied to other institutions through multiple arrangements, and these organizational ties will affect the attitudes and behaviors of actors within the institution. So, depending on the institutional circumstances, a person may use or may not use the opportunities she has thanks to her network position, while another person may respond in a different way to the same constraints. So here we have a much more complex brokerage situation than in person-to-person situations. Now, this institution's brokerage, it can be actor-driven when a person in the organization connects people to other people or to other organizations or their resources. And it can be institution-driven because the institution provides the settings for it with its norms and rules. And it can be purposive and it can be non-purposive. What Small also pointed to is that people in unmediated relationships, so outside of institutional settings, in general do not perceive each other as competitors. competitors. In his book, Someone to Talk To, he asked what kind of similarity matters in a given context, and he identified also the importance in forming ties in terms of situational and structural similarity, meaning that people who are nearly equivalent structural positions within the network will potentially form ties. So just to sum up, independent of their own intentions, people are more likely to form ties when they have the possibility for interaction in spaces, in institutions, whether formal or informal. Their interactions within those institutions are mediated by particular context. They're more likely to form ties when they do so, when they interact frequently, even have some sort of a routine, when they are focused on some activity, when they are not competitors, and when they have a reason basically to cooperate. On this journey on how people make or fail to make ties, I also find very inspiring the text actually by Janine de Hinden on boundary work in networks of the inhabitants actually of Neuchâtel. And she distinguished in her work between network boundaries, symbolic and social boundaries, and said that network boundaries are translated into demarcated symbolic boundaries, sometimes leading to social boundaries. She created a typology to identify actually specific clusters of persons who show different network boundaries, and she wrote that they are differently positioned than in the city and stratified the urban space. Now, network boundaries, I think, can be seen as the outcome of active boundary drawing along different categories, such as nationality, education, and class, but also as an outcome of certain routine interactions that lead to a maintenance of existing boundaries. So in the sense, people fail to form ties, yes? She formulated a hypothesis that the local and historical anchoring was the main driving force of both the specific network composition and the appearing network boundaries of she called the local old established, so those who were born in Switzerland and did not have migration experience. In other ties, both the highly skilled, the guest workers or newcomers, this local anchoring which might actually provide an opportunity to interact, a space for common encounters seems to be missing. Now let me now turn to the context that I'm researching and analyzing for quite some years now, that is migration between Ukraine and Poland, and I will focus first on Poland in terms of a research context. So I wanted to reflect not so much on my positionality as a researcher, but on the context actually of doing migration research in Poland. As I mentioned already, Poland was and continues to be a country of emigration, and only recently it turned into a country of immigration. And for that reason, when carrying out research among the largest national group, that is Ukrainians, multiple parallels are drawn to migration of Poles when it comes to the character of labor migration, temporary, secular, the strategies they use, and so on. I think this matters because thanks to this comparison, there is a bit of a less of a tendency to other migrants in research. It is also important to know that Poland actually practically never had an official migrant integration policy, and Ukrainian migrants were never seen as a group that somehow should be targeted by any form of integration. However, in research and in public and political discourse, migrants from Ukraine are often treated as a homogeneous group, and it is assumed that due to their cultural proximity to Poles, they will blend in with Polish society. So here we have this assumption that someone's cultural background linked to ethnic origin is supposed to explain us something, yes? There's a strong conviction that Ukrainian migrants must have multiple ties to Poles. Now, the research that I carried out together with my colleagues from the Center of Migration Research proved that this conviction is actually wrong. With each research, the Ukrainian migrant community proved to be more and more internally diverse than we assumed, especially since the increase in the number of people coming to Poland after 2014 and now after February 2020. Now, to understand the importance of changes in structural and institutional context is an overview here you see of particular macro processes affecting social change in Polish society in general and of migrants from Ukraine in Poland in particular. The main reason that people have circulated between Ukraine and Poland in the 1990s was this ease of entry, in contrast to the difficulty actually to reach EU countries. The fact, of course, that it was geographically closer, it was less expensive, and there was the migrants' familiarity with the common post-communist reality. What characterized this migration and characterizes it until today also was that it was primarily based on social networks to receive documents, cross the border, trade, or find work. Migration began to intensify in 2014, and basically this is the moment where we see a change in terms of Poland's migration status, because the numbers really skyrocketed in terms of number of documents being given out. This occurred next to the positive migration balance observed for the first time actually in post-war history of Poland, and Poland occupying the top position among OECD countries with the highest number of temporary migrant workers. The presence of Ukrainian nationals became visible in the service sector, in public space. The interaction between Poles and Ukrainians have turned into an everyday experience, not only in cities, but also in towns and villages. This coincided with the rapid politicization of the discourse around immigration in Poland, which has to be, of course, considered in the light of the general change in public attitudes in the EU as it faced the so-called refugee crisis. With the 2013-2014 Euromaidan protests and the Russian-Ukrainian military conflict, migrants started to arrive in Poland not only from Western Ukraine, but also from other regions, and originating from more central and eastern provinces. Many of them spoke Russian, not Ukrainian, and this group was then generally younger, predominantly composed of men, contrary to previous cohorts. And with the outbreak of the full-scale war, we have yet another change in terms of numbers, and the character of migration, of course, having changed to forced, and the character of the population changed to women with children arriving due to war. Now I want to present to you two cases from my research that I have conducted. The research, sorry, because this is, okay, I thought I have another slide, but the research that I conducted did not focus actually on answering the question how migrants form social ties, but on what are the characteristics and functions of ties. But the results of these findings made me, among others, ask this question. Just to give you in one sentence an overview of the research results from which the first case comes from is Ukrainian migrants' social networks were very homogeneous in terms of the network band basically along ethnicity, level of education, and character of work. Very few ties to Poles. However, those migrants who had more strong ties in Poland could count on emotional support. This was provided by co-ethnics, and they were more likely actually to be occupationally mobile. And this emotional support predicted their intentions to stay in Poland. Now, if you look at the case of Petro, someone who we can call Petro, I wanted here to reflect a bit on the when there is the possibility of interaction and whether these interactions allow actually to make new useful ties. Petro, he had higher education. The moment he arrived to Poland in 2012, he arrived to get another MA. He brought his parents, his sister over. At the time of the interview, he spoke already fluent Polish. He has left actually the university at this moment because he was working in Warsaw at a multinational corporation. During the interviews, we asked our interviewees to write down on a piece of paper people and institutions with whom they have regular contacts, and Petro identified 70 people: his parents, his sister, his girlfriend, 5 friends who were living in Ukraine, and the rest of the people were living in Poland, and most of them Petro has met already after he has arrived in Poland. He claimed he had no regular contacts with institutions, only some ad hoc contacts with NGOs. Now, if we look at how Petro made new ties, we can see from his history that he befriended actually Poles who came to his town for academic exchange and who actually inspired him to go to Poland. Then at some stage he was supported by a professor from his university in Ukraine to organize academic exchange in Poland. Now, this institutional context of the university that provided the space as well for regular interactions on the one hand, and provided institutional ties from one organization to another here is clearly important. He maintained ties with his family, not only bringing them over to Poland, but living in the same apartment. He received financial but also emotional support, and he maintained on a regular basis contact via communicators with his friends back in Ukraine and those from Ukraine who were in Poland. Now, the other space of regular interaction was the company he worked at the moment of the interview. He got the job when the number of Ukrainians in Poland has already increased substantially, and companies started to respond to this pool of labor by creating special departments that focused on trading with so-called Eastern countries. Like Petro actually interacted on a regular basis every day with 25 people who are all Ukrainian and Russian native speakers, and some of these people became his friends. Now, from his first year in Poland, in terms of his studies, there were some Ukrainian students who also became his friends. Here they exchanged some practical favors, such as help in renovating apartments and, yes, basically letting some friends stay at the apartment and so on. Now, as we know, migration as an important life event restructures networks, and this is among others visible in Petro's story of, as he ironically already in the interviews referred to them, brave Polish students who, although interacting on an everyday basis with Petro during their academic exchange in Ukraine, later on disappeared from his life. So these ties to Poles, whom he saw for a moment even as friends, were lost. Now, I would not assume actually that the Polish students lost interest in keeping in touch with Petro for some rational reasons, that they calculated that this is no longer worth to keep in touch, as he served maybe to be a good guide in this Ukrainian town, but not in Warsaw. I would hypothesize that the institutional space that maintained this tie disappeared. They no longer were at the one university, no longer stayed at the same dorm. An additional hypothesis can be that those Polish students re-entered the routine interactions of their network, and it would actually require additional effort to maintain a new tie with someone. When asked during the interview why he has only Ukrainians among his friends and acquaintances, he kept on pointing to the specificity of the space of interaction, so work and studies, where he only met Ukrainians. What I think is also important is that he said that he tried to move to other circles, probably referring here as well to the lost ties to Poles, but that he didn't manage to. So in this sense, not only his personal preferences plays a role to stay among connationals, he experienced this inability to move out from this circle as some form of network boundaries on the side of Poles. However, he himself draws also boundary. He underlines his class by pointing out that some of the people, that the people in his network are similar, not so much in terms of wealth, having the same earnings, but it's a mix of resources. It's, as Bourdieu described it, yes, it's a matter of ties to some influential others, having higher education, having the knowledge and the style actually to occupy high status positions. Petro defines other labor migrants as those who have completely different views. He not only distances himself from Ukrainian who of working class background, but he sees them as those who compete in the labor market. Meanwhile, he does not see his own work colleagues as competitors, but as those who cooperate with each other because of similar values. The second case I wanted to present today comes from a very recent research among forced migrant women from Ukraine and Poland. Now, Irina is 43 years old, comes from an eastern region in Ukraine and had no previous ties to Poland nor migration experiences. She arrived in Poland for the first time in April 2020 with her 2 children, soon after the outbreak of the blockade. She couldn't find any accommodation, and through a volunteer whom she met at the train station, ended up staying at a hostel for Ukrainian refugees. Because of the so-called special law, so the Act on Assistance to Ukrainian Citizens in connection with the armed conflict on the territory of the country, she had legal residence status. She received the so-called PESEL UKR, special identity number, that gives her full access to the labor market, to healthcare, to social support. Her children have been already in Polish school since May 2022, and she continues actually to work online for a bank in Ukraine. But because the online work is not sufficient to support her stay in Poland, she works as a cleaner for an informal company led by another Ukrainian. She continues to live at the hostel because she's unable to find affordable housing. Now we have here a woman with a legal status of residence, access to the labor market, but with childcare obligations, 2 jobs, not being actually official jobs in the Polish labor market, with unstable housing conditions. How is she able to make new, meaningful ties? Again, in the context of the 2 institutions she functions in, so the hostel and the informal cleaning company, Irina made ties to a Ukrainian woman working at the hostel where she stays with her children. And this woman, she shared with her information how to legalize her stay, but she organized it as well. She brought her to the place where she received her registration number, where she opened a bank, where she received a social insurance number as well. She also shares with her some information about housing possibility. Another Ukrainian whom Irina approached on the internet site for Ukrainians seeking jobs in Poland turned up to be the head of an informal cleaning company. As Irina at this stage barely speaks Polish, she finds also quite challenging really to speak in Polish. The woman from the informal cleaning company makes all the calls to find clients, arranges cleanings, she's flexible when it comes to childcare duties, discusses the level of earnings with the clients, and facilitates actually healthcare emergencies. Both of these ties are the result, I think, of Irina's presence in those particular institutions. So a hostel that was organized by a non-governmental organization to help Ukrainians and an informal cleaning company. The resources she received through the persons working for those institutions were mediated by the rules of those institutions. I assume that the Ukrainian woman from the hostel informed Irina and organized her initial adaptation in Poland as part of her work duties. Meanwhile, the woman who is heading the informal cleaning company organized basically in Irina's work schedule as her informal employee. However, the hostel is also a place that where encounters happen that are not necessarily institutionally mediated. Irina meets there a woman from her own region, and they become friends, providing each other with emotional support in those very difficult times. Now, overall, the opportunities for Irina and for her children, as we can see here in the quote, to interact with new people are very limited. She says, now we don't go anywhere, talking about also extracurricular activities of her children. She does not mention the school to which her children attend at the moment of the interview. They were attending it already for a few months. She does not mention it as a place of possible encounter, but I think it's a matter also of a short period, the lack of knowledge of Polish, and the fact that her children, being 12 and 14, went actually to the school quite independently already. Now, although Irina has immediately after her arrival to Poland, she received legal access to the labor market and social support, which actually labor migrants from Ukraine who worked in low-skilled sectors did not have. Her situation in some respects is similar, and in some it's even more precarious. The opportunities are there, but she cannot really access them. She's unable to attend Polish language courses due to lack of time, burdened by her two jobs, childcare, and trying to find accommodation. Domestic work is a rather isolating experience, unless one interacts with the Poles who have ordered the cleaning services, but again, she does not know Polish. And at this stage, she did not point to her multiple cleaning jobs as a source of social capital, which actually women who circulate between Poland and Ukraine for a long time and work in the domestic sector do. She's unable to work at a factory on the basis of a regular contract, as the jobs that were available, such as night shifts, were completely incompatible with childcare duties. She's unable to transfer to the Polish branch of the bank she used to work in Ukraine because she lacks diplomas in terms of formal education in banking. She lacks a Polish diploma, and her years of work experience in the bank are not acknowledged. And again, because she does not know Polish, it is a bit of a vicious cycle here, with her uncertainty, of course, aggravated by the ongoing war. And although there's a large population of Ukrainian nationals, with almost 1 million actually Ukrainians holding a PESEL Ukr in the beginning of this year, many of them face a similar situation. So this network inequality, I think, may not result here from this lack of migrants' agency, but from particular structural and institutional embeddedness, or actually lack of certain institutional embeddedness. Now, in the two cases I presented, we can see that independent of their own intentions, people actually fail to form ties when they do not have the possibility for interaction in particular spaces and institutions, even if those institutions exist, but they are not accessible because of lack of time or lack of diplomas. That the moment they have the possibility to interact within institutional settings, their interactions are mediated by the particular context, as was the context of work for Petro and Irina. These ties were formed because they were repeated practically every day around a particular activity, and we see also how migrants view the similarity of their network members when it comes to a particular social status and resulting network position, as in the case of Petro, being young, having higher education, and not viewing his colleague from work as competitors, which allowed him to change actually these contacts into friendship ties. Now, I think that in this urge to overcome structural determinism when thinking about social networks, which I think is on the one hand correct, we seem as well to overlook a bit the structure, that it does matter and it does condition the possibility of agency. And that also structural obstacles such as language barriers or the recognition of educational credentials prevent migrants from participating in mainstream society. And when thinking about how people fail to make meaningful social ties, let us pay attention not only and not primarily to the personal similarities, but to the character of the context of regular interactions due to, among other, baseline and organizational homophily. Important it is also to take into account macro-social processes and their impact on the changing access to and character of these institutional environments. But so following small, I would say that it is important to draw attention to the fact that social capital also can be an unintended outcome of a particular network structure, which is conditioned here by institutional embeddedness, And I think that this question on whether network inequality results from lack of institutional spaces for regular interactions should be a matter of further research, and that the answer to how we form ties is actually crucial to understand this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Now I invite Naila to sit here and to make a few comments. Maybe Marta, you can sit also there. So you're engaged in another conversation.
Yes, thank you very much, Marta. It's very interesting and also this presentation, a talk where you have actually strongly due attention to boundary processes influenced by various macrostructural factors, political context, migration, labor market, but also, as you mentioned, homophily, class, gender, or other similar attributes actually does matter. And you made an important argument here that context, in particular formal and informal institutional contexts for interaction matter very much and mediate these processes of inter and intra-group differentiation. And this resonates somehow with the argument developed by Louise Ryan, mentioned as well, for paying attention to what she called differentiated value. And if I correct, she points that actually migrants are able to negotiate belonging and attachment in a dynamic way, as dynamic, temporal, spatial, and relational processes. So she put at the core this very complex interplay of structural but also relational, spatial, and temporal value. And from this parallel, I would like to bring into the discussion the dynamics of the time formation and boundary making processes within personal networks, changing context along these three dimensions. First, temporality, or rather I would say overlapping temporality, because personal networks change over time for different reasons. Transformation of structural conditions, but also along with different stages of their own migratory trajectory and changing needs related to these phases, as well as life course-related events or family-related events as well. Second, speciality. Personal networks of migrants are usually transnational. We've had this discussion before, but this often goes beyond the migration of the migrant. I think the geographical dispersion also concerns movements of the others, the members of personal networks, where other significant others move, but also where they stay. Counts as well. So I think this gives the complexity of this special aspect. And third, and I would say on the top, relationality, and more specifically relational work, relational resources, and reciprocity within migrants' personal social networks, which are of course related to other previous dimensions. So my question here is, when it comes to this very complex, elements that actually contribute to the making and remaking of social ties within changing contexts at a structural but also at a personal level, time. How actually could we take it complex interplay between these three different relations, namely changes in context together with changes across time, in network composition, numbers dispersion, and resource circulation. And what this implies for us as researchers in terms of research designs, methodologically speaking as well, talk more about name generators methods. Are this enough? What would you suggest? I have maybe I have a list, but I will not. It's late, and I will stay with maybe 2 or 3 small other points. Homophily, and you actually mentioned this as a core principle to understand how actual mechanisms of networking processes. And I was wondering, what are the challenges for the homophily rule in crisis migration? You gave this example, the case of Irina, and you saw that, for instance, class homophily didn't really function here. And in our own project, actually, I found a fascinating the case of an Ukrainian woman with high education, economic situation in Ukraine, who found herself living with her 3 children in the outskirts of a big city in Romania, in a poor neighborhood where many Roma families. And she explains to us how friendly and helpful Roma neighbors were to her family, concluding that Roma here in Romania are much nicer than in Ukraine. This shows that actually, I think this person would never actually create ties with Roma people in Ukraine. But in certain contexts, class affiliation becomes negotiated. And surprisingly, in this case, some barriers are removed. So my point here would be that there are also contexts in which homophily might be challenged. And I think this would be really interesting to further explore and question. And there is another challenge also that may surface in the context of war-related forced migration. The issue of ideological conflict. We found also many actually broken ties, broken relationships, even with relatives, family members, pro-Russian orientations. And this resonates somehow with what presented before, this embedding approach by Miranda and Party. So my question here would be, what do absent or broken or lost ties, to also explain in the federal case, tell us, but in that particular context of crisis migration, and how to capture that? Because I think we have much to learn from this, but it's not necessarily present there. So yeah, also. And finally, I think I will stop with the last point, and I come to digitally mediated networks, and I was wondering how this fits into this analytical model. Is boundary mapping similar or a different process in this case? Is clustering as important as you found and showed in your research? Because it seems to me that virtual space can be also seen as somehow a different or an alternate, a non-institutionalized space or context of interaction. And although it was also shown that homophily also works in social media networks, etc., I also rely on an example from our research. We were studying the Romanian case, a Telegram-driven support network, and found high heterogeneity in terms of class, ethnicity, and this different context of interaction and tie formation is rather characterized by more flexible or blurring boundaries, with more flexible membership rules. One can get in or out as she wish. Key information is a collective resource circulating in this network which members can access without necessarily investing all this kind of networking work and resource and time. So how do you see this? How could we actually look into these digitally mediated, I would say, networks? Are the same tools enough? Again, not specific. I think I will spell it with these other points. I think there are big questions you don't need to take everything into discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. These are great questions. Think over. So maybe starting with the first one, how to include all those different layers in terms of structure and agency, I would say, yes, because we have as you mentioned, on the one hand, we have macro processes that are impacting certain levels at certain institutional structures at the meso level, and then how basically migrants may respond to this or not. I think this is very much linked to, I think structure really impacts the ability really to act, and migrants can change it to some extent, but I don't think so much. Yes, so I think in that sense, that's why I refocused a bit on structure again, because I thought, okay, we are putting a lot of emphasis on agency, but at the same time, yes, this is a little bit of this trap of potentially blaming the victims, yes, of not being, yes, agentic enough, of not being able to mobilize the resources enough, although maybe they are there. But I'm trying to show that actually, because of the fact that the ties are mediated by the institutions we are in, it really matters in which institutions we are, what are the rules and resources within that institutions, what quality ties we can come up with from interactions within that institution. That it really actually is, it matters. How to in terms of how to capture this research-wise, as I said, and these are questions that came to me from another research. So this is still a way to think forward how potentially to analyze this. But I think, as we mentioned, in terms of more longitudinal research that would show us in these actually very dynamic times right now, yes, the war is still going on. We see that it's basically the strategies of the people are changing quite quick. Because at first, we're more focused on thinking about, okay, and soon we will return. We're not even thinking about adapting and to the current circumstances too much. And that this, I think, if you look at longitudinal research, if you return later on, then maybe it's potential to see how the change macro social processes have also impacted the way people use their social networks and the way they are able to restructure these networks as well. Yes, I'm wondering that I really have the impression right now that the forced migrant population that is right now in Poland is very precarious situation in terms of this sense of temporariness due to the war, but also due to their temporary status, and that this is it seems that the practice is more of a day to day, yes, day after day, what will come with the next day way of thinking, and not thinking, okay, I don't know what the future will bring, so I will not think now that my life will be potentially in this place or in another, but there is a lot of, I think, uncertainty in crisis that as I said, comes with it. In terms of homophily, that can be challenged as well by such crisis situations. I think, of course, again, in this even in this example you gave, it's the fact that this woman found herself in the surrounding, I understand, in a village that was Roman, that basically, because of the context as well, these were the people and resources she could rely on. So again, I think that doesn't prove the homophily principle wrong. I think that we have this tendency still, but again, I think it shows us just the importance of the surroundings, of the environment we function in, as well in terms of institutional environment. What you mentioned as well in terms of Telegram, I'm not so well in terms of, I haven't really researched digitally mediated networks, so but I would assume that this is a very specific space, because as you said, they're not, it doesn't need investment, there won't be that many consequences if you decide to leave it. Depending again who is on the other side, yes, in this digitally mediated. Are these people who you know from your everyday experiences back home? Are these people who you have met before, or is this something new? Is this an exchange in terms of, we're focused on whether finding jobs or finding an accommodation and so on, for exchanging information and so I think that very much depends what is the topic behind as well this exchange. What is actually the research that is exchanged? And maybe I don't know what part of it, because you said there was a lot of heterogeneity, but
this is a news
okay.
Arrival, of course.
And it's among Ukrainians, maybe.
Among Ukrainians.
With local people. Okay.
Exchange of information and support. And actually, all kind of people actually join into group and to discussions and share all these actually resources. Yeah.
But I always, when I think about digitally mediated networks, I always think, okay, there is, you have to be digitally literate, so to say, yes, and this is a major, I think, line here where you lose part of the population that potentially could be part of your network, or yes, who you cannot maintain ties with through such means. And I'm not sure if this is non-institutional. I would say that it also has its own rules, probably, that, and there is someone who is probably monitoring, moderating this, yes, yes, moderating maybe as well that there are not that animosities coming up, yes, or maybe someone is removed, maybe you don't see that, but maybe someone is blocked, is putting up some aggressive or whatever racist comments or so. So, so that came to my mind. When it comes to broken ties, yes, and divided families, I think this is really crucial, yes, because this is also also something that is not spoken about as well. Yes, the fact that people who have escaped the war have, for example, family in Russia and are completely yes, basically cannot communicate almost in any way, not to put into danger as well family members, and not being sure when they see each other. So so I think these ties they can be I think they're dormant. I think this is the idea that they're dormant. It depends as well, again, in case there is communication. And again, this is research that was done by Olena Fediuk that comes to my mind, that the communication is misplaced in the sense that there was also, well, the siblings, yes, the brother was in Russia, the Ukrainian woman was in Italy, and the father was in the middle of basically ongoing war, and the brother would communicate via WhatsApp to her sister that he knows that this is all fake. Yes, that he knows that this is not happening, and that father is well, but just doesn't answer his phone. And the question again is this something he's saying because he has to say it, because he is also afraid to say actually he knows what is going on, and he lives in a police state, and someone will come and basically there will be consequences for him. But in again, this sister is accepting this as for her. The way she reflected on it, this was a broken tie. But I think this doesn't mean really it is broken. It may mean that after the war is finished, certain things, there may be some communication going on and exchange, and actually we don't know really what is going on the other side, yes, in terms of what extent people are actually forced to give a certain message across, and in that sense. Yeah, I'm not sure because there are quite these are really things that I will have to think over as well. But the first one was a major one because it as well as you said, the dynamics is very difficult to catch, but I think it is very important. So I think for me the answer would be this more like longitudinal, and I would prefer probably qualitative network research to look at the different movements, how cope with the very, very fast actually changing reality right now, but how again this affects the closer environment they are functioning. So in this way, maybe 3 layers can be shown, and then of course people organize themselves as well along with such crisis situations. They have a new common goal to act as well. So that was as well, I mean, the most active in terms of providing help as well to the forced migrants coming from Ukraine, or in terms of bringing help to the Ukrainian army was the Ukrainian community, and with people volunteering and who have never met before actually volunteering around us. So in that sense, they were changing the structure again because a lot of new organizations were formed, also informal, never formalized. So that make a difference, so to say, in the way people were received, in the way as well. I guess.
You questions, or still have 10 minutes.
thanks, Mark, for talk, and thanks, kind of comments. And I really think it's an interesting question. You asked how do people think to make use of social ties. And I also like very much the really emphasis on, well, structure is important. I really think this is absolutely crucial. We know it from a lot of research. But then I was thinking about, okay, but where is really the meaning making in all this? I feel like in the first example, you actually introduced it a bit, if I'm right, am I correct? But in the second example, I mean, what was her interpretation? I felt like it's less strong. So could you tell us a bit more about this? Also, I feel like I don't have it really in detail anymore, but in the first example, you put some how he interprets things and how this contributed really to boundary making. But in the second example, I felt a bit less. So maybe you could just very shortly elaborate this. Because I really think it goes together. Because meaning making can also be structural in a way.
I think in terms of meaning making, she, especially in terms of the case of this informal cleaning company and the woman basically is leading it. For her, she said it was okay. It was the fact that she needed the money as well to support herself, but she said it was crucial because it was for her also a way to keep her busy, to not to think about what is going on, in Ukraine with her husband and so on. So in that sense, it played not only a functional role because of her constraints of not knowing the language and so on, but it plays also a role, giving her the possibility to be active, to be agentic in that way, and to keep herself busy and basically not because the other avenues she was trying and they were closed somehow, and I think it's highly ironic because the discourse again is we are giving everything to Ukrainian migrants, but in the end they end up in the very with the same or even worse challenges than irregular labor migrants do, unless again they don't have childcare duties, they somehow manage to have a diploma that is acknowledged and so on. But this is rather the minority in terms of people who have arrived. So I would say that in terms of meaning making as well, when it comes to the woman in the hostel, I think she mentioned, again, these are again interviews that were not aimed at that question, so I'm a bit reading between the lines as well here. But she, it was someone who facilitated her entry to Poland, her at least solved certain issues because again she was not she did not have anyone. This is we have an example of a person who arrives, although she arrives with a mass of people, she is alone in that context. So in this sense, this was someone from her from her language group, from her country, who actually was provided her with at least some basic information that allowed her to make these first steps in. So in that sense, yes, but that would, I think it would really require a research that asks these questions, that follows with who actually how did it matter that that this person appeared in their lives? I mean, I think for her it was also crucial that like she couldn't really. I mean, she was struggling so much to find a different place as well, to move finally from this hostel. But again, it's a bit again being a bit trapped, yes, because on the other hand, this hostel did provide her with assistance, and if there was no one else. Then she kept staying basically at this place.
Another question? And one last. If that's not the case, then I would like to thank you once again, Marta.